How you doing? That was horrifying. One more time. How you doing? Great. It's awesome to be back here with all of you here at Transform. I was last here in 2011, just before the book that John mentioned got published. Because many of you may not know very much about me, I thought I'd tell you just a couple of quick things about myself. I'm a futures researcher, which means I study complex trends in economics, ecology, emerging technologies, demographics, and how these emerging forces of change might shape the world in the next, not just 1 to 3 years, but over the course of the next 5, 10, 15 years and longer. I serve as one of the explorers at the National Geographic Society. I'm part of their Big and Tall program, where they fit fat men into submarines and send them to the bottom of the ocean. I run this organization, PopTech, that brings together scientists and technologists and engineers and designers and social and ecological innovators, people working in public health and many other fields, to work together on new approaches to some of the world's toughest problems. Now, this morning, what I'd like to talk to you about is a little bit about our ongoing journey, understanding the dynamics of complexity, collapse, reorganization, and resilience. And it's on that last word that I think all of us can relate in these very, very difficult times in which we have so much volatility across so many different parts of our society and parts of the emerging order. All of us experience occasional disruptions. I thought I'd share with you just the most recent one that I saw a friend of mine sent to me. Can you guys roll that tape?
Or close your eyes and just fall down, okay? Your sides? Okay.
Okay, it's called the trust fall. Okay, trust fall. Ready, set, go.
We've all been there. So to start my remarks today, I thought I'd share with you my single favorite quote. Can you guys take that? Thank you very much. My single favorite quote. It's from a physicist who was a contemporary of Einstein's. His name was John Wheeler. Wheeler gave us the concept of the black hole. In fact, he named black holes before there was an instrument to actually identify whether or not this hypothetical natural phenomenon actually existed. And Wheeler said, "We shape the world by the questions we ask." I think that he was talking about quantum mechanics, but I mean it in a much more general sense. And I think in many ways, what we're here to do together over the course of these days is to ask the right kinds of questions, the right kinds of provocative questions, not necessarily aligning on an answer, but understanding how by asking better questions we get to more interesting ways of seeing the world. So the question that I'm spending a lot of my time thinking about these days is really predicated on the enormous amount of volatility and disruption that all of us are experiencing economically, socially, ecologically, medically, in all of these big complex systems. There's a kind of central question that comes up again and again and again. How do we help our people and our systems recover, persist, or even thrive amid disruption? If there's a design brief for the 21st century, this is clearly it. And we've been spending our time going all over the world looking at the emerging heuristics of resilient systems. Now, that broad question actually decomposes into a couple of contemporary concurrent verbs. And I thought I'd share with you just a little quick mental model about how we think about resilience in this context. The first set of things that all resilient systems do, whether they're people, communities, societies, individuals, or families, is they spend a whole bunch of time building regenerative capacity, capacity that builds upon itself. In the context of communities, which you've heard over and over again from this stage, much of that is driven by the logic, by the grammar of trust. Because trust is the ability, it's the core asset on which collaboration and sharing and work together, whether it's working among patients like you just heard, or whether it's working in and across the formal and informal parts of the healthcare system, it's essential. but all systems do this. Nerve cells in our brains do this, neurons do this, communities do this, organizations do this. The second bucket of activities is around sensing emerging risks, listening for change. How do we enable systems? How do we instrument them to listen for disruption? Then, how do we respond when that disruption occurs? And unfortunately, most of our conversation about complex change and disruption picks up when the disruption has occurred. But a more comprehensive model looks way back and way forward. In fact, after responding to disruption, there's another part of the system that is engaged in learning and transformation. And here's the really important thing. There are enormous feedback loops all the way through all of these parts of the system. A healthy, resilient industry, a healthy, resilient healthcare system, a healthy, resilient family, patient, network, community, organization, hospital, profession is doing all of these things at the same time in some capacity. Your body is doing all of these things right now in all different parts of your biology. So I thought what I'd do is take us on a little bit of a tour of some of the lessons for building that capacity. But before I do, I think the subject of this panel and this session is about complexity. And I think all of us know that we live within a system that is full of knots, Gordian knots, and deep complexity, right? The giant hairball, the giant yarn ball. And in the giant yarn ball, it's one of the most important fundamental lessons that we can have when thinking about interacting with a complex system. Any complex system, but particularly the ones that are defined by the kinds of wicked problems that exist within the healthcare system, resist mere cleverness. We are not going to hack. We are not going to come up with some elegant little trick that's going to get us through the complexity. The watchwords here are about simplicity. They're about listening, as you heard. They're about patience and gentle action over big moves, single steps, single silver bullets. Now, that kind of thinking requires us to make a series of changes in the way we relate to the entire system. The first shift is giving up the myth that we are fully in control of the system. We actually have to give up the hubris that we fully understand the system that we're in. And we have to make ourselves prepared for and okay with the reality of surprise. Some of you will get that joke. That also means that we have to begin to shift the way we think about building systems so that we're not designing them to deliver at peak efficiency, which is a natural instinct of systems designers. It's natural for us to want to build systems that move to the greatest use of resources. But in a complex system, the greatest use of resources is often associated, the most efficient state of the system is often the most fragile. So we need to think about a different way of designing, one that accommodates graceful failure so that every domino that gets knocked over doesn't knock over every other domino. And one of the things we do when we build efficiency is we tie the dominoes more and more closely together. The next thing we have to do is make a shift in the way we think from parts and stocks and objects to systems and flows and propensities. We have to think about the dynamics, the cadence of a system, not merely its resources. And we have to think about eliminating the distinction that you heard both of the former presenters talk about, the distinction between us and them. We have to shift from bureaucracy to what we call adhocracy, which is the ability of a system to improvise. What is the improvisational quotient of your organization? What is the improvisational quotient of healthcare in general? In some cases, it's very, very high. And in some cases, a relentless desire for standardization, which delivers value in the near term, has eliminated, it's destroyed our ability to deliver improvisation when it's needed, when the system moves into a state that we don't understand. And ultimately, the way we get past that is about thinking about moving from doing for people to doing with them, to working with communities as opposed to working for them. And that, in turn, shifts the way we think about risk, from merely bouncing back to keeping this system as a whole in a place of creative possibility. This is the kind of pattern language that you see among highly resilient systems, systems that can absorb disruption, systems that can absorb volatility, systems that fail. One of the challenges of the way we think about designing systems is that we design them with the idea that failure is an enemy. But without failure, you do not get the reorganization of resources that's predicated on learning. There is no learning without failure. There is no failure without risk. And if you think about the way we design systems, particularly in healthcare, we design them to design all the risk out of the system. So I want to leave you today with 3 strategies that we've seen over and over again, contemporary strategies for bolstering the resilience of systems and people. And the first one we're going to do together is about making the invisible visible. So we're going to do this first exercise together, and we're going to do it as a game, okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you 2 images on the screen. They're going to blink back and forth like this, okay? And here's what I'd like you to do. Just look at exactly the same on both monitors. Pick a monitor. And I'd like you to identify the one and only one difference between the 2 images. And when you've seen it, I'd like you to gently raise your hand sufficiently that I can count you, but not so you block the person behind you. You got that? Okay. Ready? Go. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay. Now, just out of curiosity, how many people here saw no difference between those 2 images? I'd like you to meet the honest cohort here at Transform 2013. I don't know what those other people were looking at. Actually, for those of you who did raise your hand having not seen the image, and by the way, the first time I was showing this, I didn't see the image either. I didn't see the change. I'd like you to pay attention to this part of the image right there. The thing that holds the airplane in the sky disappeared in front of your eyeballs over and over and over again, and 98% of the people in the room didn't see it. And we all had access to the data. We all had access to that data. 100% data transparency. It was flashing in front of your eyeballs over and over again. So why didn't you see it? Well, the reason you didn't see it is that our brains are riddled with cognitive biases. But in particular, they're biases that guide our perception to certain aspects of a scene over another. So for instance, how many people here started by looking at the soldiers? Right. Did you decide to look at the soldiers? No, your brain just went there. Because for hundreds of thousands of years, the most important thing to us and our ancestors was what other people were doing. So we're very good at paying attention to foreground change. We're very bad at thinking about background change. And in fact, there's a wonderful forecaster and thinker about the future, Stuart Brand, who said this very beautifully. He said, in our society, the fast-moving trends get most of the attention, but it's the slow-moving trends, it's the stuff in the background that you don't notice that actually have most of the power. And I'll give you an example of how this has real implications for the world around us. The behavioral scientist Dan Ariely did a study, and he asked people who were voters, Republicans and Democrats and wealthy people and middle-income people and lower-income people, a whole skew of humanity, what do you think the income distribution is among the 5 quintiles of Americans? What do you think the top 20% earns, the next 20%, the middle 20%, the second to lowest 20%, and the bottom 20%? What do you think the skew is about who owns what percentage of the pie? And here's what he got. was really interesting. Most of the answers were pretty consistent. Most people thought that the top 20% took a little more than half of the total income. Now, what's really interesting, then he asked them, what is the ideal spread? What should it be? Which is basically a test for communism, right? It's a test for socialism. What should, if you could optimally redistribute the wealth among everybody in society, what ought to be? And here's the thing that's fascinating. Every single category said the income skew should be more equitable. Every single one of us thought the distribution of wealth should be fairer. But what was really fascinating was what the actual income distribution is, and that's this. The bottom 20% owns almost zero. It's invisible. It owns so little as a percentage of the total that the bottom 20% doesn't show up on this kind of distribution. And the reason that's important is you cannot fix what you cannot see. You cannot fix what you cannot see. And over again, the history of progress is shaped by our ability to observe reality, to observe the truth. One of my favorite data visualization exercises as we embrace this world of big data, there's this wonderful project done at Columbia called $1 Million Blocks, in which the researchers got their hands on a fantastic data set. The data set was the location at time of arrest, the residence at time of arrest. What was your residential address at the time you were arrested in the borough of Brooklyn? Not where were you arrested, but where do you live? That's very hard data to get access to. And then what they did is they cross-tabulated that with how much the city was spending on social services for the residents of that block. And what you see is all those blocks in red are blocks where the state of New York is spending more money incarcerating the residents of that block than they are on delivering education, health care, and aggregate social services to that block. And that is the beginning of real change. So let's embrace big data. Let's do what John said. Let's eliminate privacy. Whew, it's going to be fabulous, right? Fabulous. Well, there's a catch. And I'll tell you about a conversation I had with a friend of mine who's a GP. He's a family doctor. He's running one of the last family doctor practices. He's not embedded. He just loves working with people, and he works in Indianapolis. And a couple of years ago, some enterprising entrepreneurs bought off of one of the local hospitals an off-year model MRI machine. They bought a scanner. They set it up on a flatbed truck. They set it up outside the mall. And then they charged people $500 or something to get a full body scan and gave it to you on DVDs. Geez, there's big data. There's all your personal, it's a perfect scan of you. And he was inundated with people who were saying, doctor, what is that thing? He'd say, your lungs, chill. He said, no, you don't understand. On my lungs, it's full of bumps. And he had to explain to them, people are lumpy. You're not a doctor. So there are limits to what data does for us. Real limits. Having the right information does not necessarily mean having more information. It means having the right information. Okay. The second thing I want to talk to you about, second little theme, is about thinking in network terms. We've heard a lot about communities, so let's talk a little bit about how we embrace communities. Now, I want to do another little exercise with you here, and here it is. I'm going to show you a network, and if you've played this game with me before, you're not allowed to play. So I'm going to show you a network, this one here, in which we've replaced all the names with numbers, so there's no gender bias. And all the purple lines in this organization connect people. So these are people who have primary relationships with each other. I want to ask you a really simple question. Let's say you wanted to tell everybody in this organization something as quickly as possible, and you can only talk to one person. Intuitively, who do you want to talk to? Shout it out. 4. Any other guesses? 8, 10. That's what I heard. The most common choices, about 85% of people guessed number 4. Number 4 is a great guess because that's the chatty Cathy node on this network. The person in your organization whose job you cannot determine, but who knows everyone's personal business. They usually organize the Oscar pool. Number 4 is a good guess because they know the most people. Number 8 is a good guess because it's a bridge node. If it doesn't get to 8, it's not going to one side of the chart or the other, so that person is particularly important. And then there's always a few people who guess number 10, which I find totally fascinating. It reveals something very deep about our instincts about leadership. And what is that instinct? Find the most isolated brother in the chart. That guy has got to be the one in charge. Why? Because you don't let that alpha gorilla run around the leadership zoo just making decisions with the other animals. It would be chaos. He'd be giving thumbs up, thumbs down to the wrong thing. So you put him behind the assistant vice president of poo flinging and the senior vice president of bananas or whatever. But this is the thing that's really fascinating about this. This is actually, none of those are the right choices. And I will admit again, the first time I was shown this chart, I guess number 4, like about 85% of you. But the interesting thing is that if you wanted to tell everybody in this network something as quickly as possible and you can only talk to one person, you'd actually want to talk to number 6 or number 7 because they're the shortest mean distance to all the other nodes in the network. And the fact that we get this wrong in 2013 here, in a moment when networks have become the primary organizational structure within which human beings self-organize, means we are change blind to the way they work in the same way that we might be change blind to things like income inequality. And remember, you can't fix what you can't see. And almost none of us saw that. And it has real implications. I'll give you an example from the real world. When Katrina hit New Orleans, this is what happened. This is a demographic bomb that went off in the United States, and it scattered people all over the country. And if you went to New Orleans, we spent a lot of time in New Orleans after Katrina for years, and as you walked through neighborhoods in the lower Ninth, Holy Cross, you'd see something really interesting. You'd walk down the street, and you'd turn, let's say, right for me, and you'd see this. You'd see a guy rebuilding his house. In particular, building a house wherein his wife and his mother had perished in the storm. Can you imagine the level of commitment to place that it takes to return to the home in which your closest family members were taken from you in an act of tremendous catastrophe? And if you turn on that same street and you turn to the right, what you see that's really fascinating is this. You see nothing. You see what looks like open prairie, the return of early growth forest. So what's the difference between what's happening on this side of the street and that side of the street? This street is the boundary between two neighborhood associations. And in the neighborhood association in which you saw that man, this woman worked, Pam DeShields, for a long time. She's what we call a translational leader, a term we meant as an homage to the idea of translational medicine. And she kept everybody's phone numbers, and she kept everybody connected, and she meticulously went through. And when you heard Gary Slutkin and the Reverend yesterday, what you were hearing, the reason that works is because it's a credible message from a credible messenger. And she's a credible messenger. That's how communities work. And we're beginning to understand how to leverage those kinds of networks to deliver real healthcare. This is a fantastic example called Mayo Clinic International. It's a group that's working in one of the most impoverished Appalachian counties in the United States and internationally, not treating patients, but treating the networks around patients. So you don't go to the doctor, your whole social network goes to the doctor together to learn the kinds of mutually reinforcing normative behavioral changes, because those are the folks who are going to ensure that they happen. And we know that happens from lots of research. A 5-year mortality and morbidity study done on breast cancer found that women's survivability went up dramatically, 25 points, when they confided in someone close to them, when they leveraged their network. All right, I'm going to leave you with one last idea, and then we'll all be done. I want to talk to you a little bit about fostering resilience within for two reasons. One is that in an era of tremendous disruption, more and more we have to think about treating and bolstering the resilience of the communities that we serve and the people who live within them, and the resilience of our own labor force within healthcare. Now, here's the science as we best understand it. Here are two sisters. Both of these sisters happen to be in the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, when an insane man with a bunch of guns came in and started shooting people. And the best science we have suggests that one of those women is going to be permanently, psychologically, and physiologically, potentially impaired by the experience. She's going to be damaged for a very long time. And the other one is going to feel tremendous grief and sadness and loss, real grieving, but is not going to be permanently damaged. The problem that we have is we don't know which is which. So we're beginning to illuminate what causes one person to be able to withstand those kinds of disruptions while another person who goes through the same experience doesn't. And it turns out it's a constellation of things. It starts with the quality and size of our social networks, how many people we know. But not just that. It's also about the quality of those relationships, particularly the quality of our most intimate pair-bonded relationships. The degree to which we love, are able to express love, and be loved in return matters enormously. Our access to resources obviously matters. Our health, more particularly our brain health, and in particular, the interactions of our genes and our lived experiences, this sort of GXE hypothesis, has a lot to say here about who's going to do well and who's going to struggle. There are a couple of really important factors, one I don't have time to get into today, which is about our beliefs. If you believe that the world is a meaningful place, if you believe that you have agency within it, if you believe that successes and failures are placed in your life to teach you things rather than being the random acts of a capricious universe, you're much more likely to process the emotional content of disruptive experiences in a way that doesn't cause you harm. But there's one area that's non-pharmaceutical where we're starting to see real change, real science delivering very, very promising and powerful results, and that's built around habits of mind. Most excitingly, because they are things you can train for. This is work that started at the University of Wisconsin with a neuroscientist named Richie Davidson, has expanded to an entire field. They started by studying the minds of actively meditating Buddhist monks. Why? Well, most of us have a theory of emotion, our kind of folk psychology of emotion. Like, you've been spending 15 minutes with me, and I hope you think I'm a pretty nice guy. I'm just looking for affirmation, people. It's not that hard. Okay, stop. I'm not that shallow. I'm telling myself over and over again, I'm not that shallow, I'm not that shallow. Just don't cut me off on the highway, right? Because if you cut me off on the highway, I will follow you home with my GPS recorder and sign you up for junk mail until it hurts. And you will understand why Italians invented opera. So that theory is, I'm going along, something happens, and I have a response, and the response is in part emotional. My emotions are responsives. The way that these folks think about emotions is that you have a reservoir of emotional response, and if you can be judicious in the way you expend that reserve, that emotiononium, you will never run dry. And if you never run dry, it's when we run dry that we do real damage to ourselves. So if we can insert more intentional practices between us and the spending of those emotional reserves, we can provide a greater prophylactic for people from emotional trauma. And that is exactly what is happening right now with emergency room physicians, active duty military officers, and just as intriguingly, these young women over here who are part of a program at Emory University run by Thaddeus Pace, in which they've been trained in what's called compassion-based cognitive therapy, and it matters a lot because all of those girls are part of the foster system, the Atlanta DCS foster system. When they come in, their C-reactive proteins, which is associated with the inflammatory response, off the charts. Their psychosocial resilience in the basement. After 6 weeks of being taught essentially secularized Buddhist contemplative practice, their C-reactive proteins are very near normal, and their psychosocial resilience has skyrocketed. That's incredibly powerful. And we've just begun to scratch the surface of how we treat this much broader array of folks and enable them to withstand the complexity. The last little project I'll show you in this regard is a wonderful one done by a designer. And I wanted to end on this note because we're here thinking about design and healthcare. It was done by a designer in Ireland named Orla O'Brien. Orla asked 250 people to draw on a standardized diagram of a human being where in their body they physically felt emotions. And then she summed them. This is actually the aggregate picture of 250 marked up illustrations by people. It's a fascinating picture. One of the things you see over there on the left is where people feel anger, where they physically feel it in their bodies. What you see on the right is where people feel love. Orla said it really beautifully. She said, anger is a force, love is a field. That's amazing. And it's designers who are telling us these kinds of facts, the kinds of facts that fit within the ways in which we're going to think about bolstering the resilience of people for years to come. It's so great to be here back with you. I just want to say you're an amazing community of people. I was so honored to come the first time, and I'm doubly honored to be back again. And I hope we'll have a lot more chances to talk. So thanks very much. You out of time, or?
I'm gonna spare you the interrogation so we can stay on time, but I will just say, resilience in pill form. Big Pharma may be already working on this based on this talk. Budium as a pill. But I have to say, your analysis of opera being a product of Italian road rage, that's a good one.
Thanks.
But every time you come, I always say, all right, I'm going to get whatever trick video he has. I'm going to see whatever it is. And you screwed me again on the jet engine, I have to say. I always get it wrong. Take care.
Thanks,
See you in
guys.
Brooklyn, buddy.